Welcome to week 3, everyone. This week we'll be spending a lot of time talking about Marx and the Communist Manifesto. You get a sense for what Marx believed to be a radical change in the way that society was organized, a transition from a feudal political order to a more modern political order. For Marx, he equated modernity with the rise of capitalism, and that's his big question: how did capitalism happen? What are the historical forces at play, and where will it go? So I wanted to just spend a little time talking a bit more about what capitalism is and how we define it. To do that, I'm going to rely on Karl Polanyi's work, The Great Transformation. And he defines capitalism as the commodification of land, labor, and money. What commodification means is that everything is for sale on a market, and I want to emphasize how novel that really is. Throughout most of human history, labor is not for sale on a market. And by a market, I mean a place where you exchange things, and the price of something is determined by the supply of it and the demand for it. Most of human history, labor in particular, has not been subjected to the impersonal forces of the market. And I think we, because it's so used to us, take it for granted that, of course, well, labor should be for sale and is naturally for sale, and that's the best way to organize society. Most traditional societies don't subject their labor to the laws of supply and demand. Instead, there's personal loyalties and obligations. So in a feudal order, for example, in a feudal order, peasants had a direct relationship to their lords. So there was a personal loyalty and obligation. And most of the things that were produced, of course, were agricultural in nature. So with an industrial system, we get this labor force that is paid a wage. Very impersonal when you stop to think about it. In addition, land, as I mentioned, so my definition is the commodification of land, labor, and money. I've already talked about labor. Let me talk a little bit about land. In traditional societies, land's not for sale, and many of you have probably heard the idea that in Native American societies in particular, there's just simply no concept for selling land. Land belongs to everybody. So again, kind of a novel idea that the land itself is for sale. And then the most abstract of all is the idea that money is for sale. Actually, the idea that money is for sale has been outlawed by many religions. So in Muslim religious belief, for example, the idea that one would charge usury is specifically outlawed. And there's been a large moral code that suggests that people shouldn't be charging money, essentially, to loan money. And so when we talk about there being a market for money, what we mean by that is that money has a price and it's dictated by the laws of supply and demand for that money. Most of us, again, probably don't think about it, but I can give you a pretty obvious case, and that is whenever you use a credit card. Of course, you are being charged a fee, or interest rather, to use that card, which is really just borrowing money. You're paying money in order to borrow that money. And that's part of what the market for money is, although it's a lot more sophisticated when you think about it in a global sense, because, of course, international currencies or national currencies are for sale in the international marketplace. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the quarter. So I hope you get that sense of modernity being this commodification of land, labor, and money. And it's really, when you follow through the logic, it's the commodification of everything. That's what capitalism brings with it, and that's what Marx was kind of aware of. And notice how much that affects our entire lives. And you as an individual can't really escape this commodification of land, labor, and money. Just think about putting your a roof over your head. You're essentially entering that market for land, right? And in order to do that, so let's say you're going to rent a place, if you're going to enter that market for land, you have to demonstrate to a prospective landlord that you have a job, you have a source of income. So you need to enter that marketplace for labor. And not only do they ask you to have a work history, they also will ask for your credit history, generally speaking. So it's hard to not also enter the marketplace for money. I'm going to put on my little paternalistic hat, though, and say, especially for the younger students who maybe are just getting credit cards, to please be careful with that. They charge you a ridiculous amount of interest, and you can get yourself in some trouble with those credit cards. So be warned. All right. Notice one last thing here, and that is how impersonal these market forces are. Right? We don't, as individuals, have any control whatsoever over the price that our labor demands or is paid in the marketplace. That's all this function, if you will, of a bunch of discrete individual choices. So no one is really in control of that. And that can be kind of alienating in some sense. We'll talk more about that issue of alienation next week, or maybe even later on this week in some of our discussion. And I hope that you kind of read through the Communist Manifesto and see if there's anything in there that might relate to that. There is one section from the manifesto, bear with me here for just a second, that I wanted to share with you. It's a pretty famous quote from Marx, and he really helps to give a good sense for what modernity is, and he connects it pretty closely to the idea of capitalism, right? So for Marx, capitalism creates constant change, and I'll just point your attention to one of the passages from the manifesto. I'm going to read it to you, so bear with me here. Here's what Marx writes. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Think back, well, actually think forward, you're going to see a lecture about the manifesto, and everything for Marx is based on the mode of production. In a capitalist system, the mode of production is based on the fact that you have a capitalist class who owns the means of production. And in order to get people to produce, they pay them a wage. Again, very impersonal, right? This, however, this system creates an incredible amount of constant change, and it structures the whole relationship of society. We'll talk more about that. It's in your lecture notes as well, so think about that a little bit. Here's how he goes on, though. The constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudice and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones are antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober sense his real condition of life and his relations with his kind. What Marx is getting at there is that all of this old, feudal, traditional way of organizing society, which is kind of fixed, if you recall, right? Remember our definition of tradition. It's fixed, and you're born into a role. All of that with capitalism changes. And not only that, capitalism itself encourages, requires, if you're a capitalist, you're required to innovate constantly and change the means of production constantly in order to survive in a capitalist environment. Marx really details that more thoroughly in Das Kapital, which we'll encounter next week. All right, take care. Let me know if you have any questions.